I'll just say thank you. I'm still chewing over. That was a lot of detail, and I really appreciate getting here. Go ahead.
Yeah, also really appreciated all of the, still digesting a lot, but yeah, just like to hear, I guess, more about you were started describing the pivot towards centering the role of women in life and the reflection of that in the political realm, and you talked about the women's Congress and or I'm not exactly sure what that was, but yeah, just wanted to hear a little bit more about that. When you get it, yeah. At
Just
some
go
point.
on. No.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, no, we go around. Okay.
However you want to do it.
Oh, well, maybe we'll just go around and hear some more.
Don't.
How about if we listen to, say around 3 questions? So Eric didn't really have a question, and then you did. And because
Just take the next person.
I just want to say thank you. I don't have a question. Just here to listen.
well, what I'm saying is we're getting about 3 questions.
Right.
Okay, we got it.
Because beyond that,
We got it.
too hard to remember.
Okay, I wanted to ask you to explain a little bit more about the actual living situations, because you mentioned Zapatista controlled areas and mixed areas. So how do people actually live? Are some people in completely Zapatista zones and other people are in living with other people? Or I wanted you to elaborate a little bit more on that. And also, my friend Steve over there said he went to Chiapas 3 times with you to visit, and I'm wondering if that's possible to do anymore, either with you or with other groups. So those are my 2 questions.
Lou?
Well, I have one. Do you want to answer that one, and then I'll ask one?
Go ahead. We have 2 questions.
Okay, my question is, how's the jungle doing? You hear about deforestation. At one point I heard the Mexican government was building a lot of roads, but there was suspicion that this suspiciously looks like a road that armed tanks and, armored units would be coming in. So I'm just wondering how the jungle itself is doing.
It's sort of my favorite topic in the whole world. Because I worked for years in the jungle. The jungle is currently issuing complaints regarding flyovers by the Mexican military planes. There are all kinds of international environmental projects and plans, all of which want to control and or displace the indigenous people who live there. Much of the control has to do with what kind of food they can grow to not harm the environment, which is, some of it is pure baloney, and other stuff, yeah, maybe they could work that in, But they're worried about large projects, such as building hotels, where they have gorgeous, rivers and lakes and that sort of thing. They're worried about dams on their rivers. They're worried about some bottling company wanting to come in and suck up all their water because they can't live without it. People in those communities are still very poor. They are definitely living below the poverty line, except for the fact that they have running water. That was one of the first things the autonomous counties did, was install water systems. They have education and they have health care, which kind of takes them maybe out of that. It looks like extreme poverty because they still live in houses with dirt floors, and they don't have bathrooms. They have latrines outdoors. But their life has definitely improved in the jungle. There are tons of roads now. Yes, they probably are for the military, but the government has eyes on the jungle for doing stuff. And it's often in the guise of, what do they call it? Green something or other?
Fake green.
Greenwashing?
Greenwashing, there you go, that's the word. Yeah, so that's what's happening in the jungle.
Do you want to talk a little bit more about the women's role in the conference?
Well, that's the second women's conference. There was also one over New Year's 2007, 2008, which I attended. I didn't go to this recent one. Before the uprising, when they were organizing internally within the EZLN, a group of women convinced everyone that there had to be a revolutionary law of women, just like there was a revolutionary law of land. And what it did was give women more or less equality of participation at all levels of Zapatismo, at all levels of the community, to hold positions in government, to choose what they want to do within the EZLN, to be able to choose their husband and not be sold in marriage, as was the custom, to choose how many how many children they have or not to have.
They have birth control?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Are we moving around? I'm asking you questions.
And so this took a long time to implement. I mean, this is not easy stuff. And in fact, the region I worked in, we initially were an all-women's group, the Chiapas Support Committee, and what we did was work with women's community stores, actually in the headquarters community of La Garucha. And one of the women who worked there, she wasn't part of our group, but she was from UC Berkeley and she was friends with us. She was working on that project, and she was like teaching the women in a workshop how to operate a grocery store. And she found out later that the comandante for that region had been listening through the slats in the wooden outdoor walls to find out what she was telling those women. Because the men were so paranoid that the women were going to take over and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it was difficult. And when Marcos was Marcos and not Galliano as he is now, he had to actually move from where he was living to La Garucha to tell the men to get their act together, because they were embarrassing, you know, the women, the men who had moved on and gone along with the program. I mean, it was bad. The machismo was incredible. And what I experienced at the first women's gathering, which was 10 years ago, was the total and complete absence of machismo. I mean, the men were there, they were allowed to babysit, they were allowed to sell food, they were allowed to clean the latrines, etc. But they were not allowed to go inside the big auditorium and either listen to the women leaders or to speak.
Oh boy.
It was really, really interesting. This time, there were no men whatsoever. There were only 7,000 women that came into this one headquarters community called Morelia. And they met, they had sports programs, they had artists, they had dancing, and the Zapatistas, both the men and the women, have become much more participatory. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that you used to go there to the big gatherings, and all you would do is hear speeches from the Zapatista comandantes. Now when you go, you hear speeches from people in civil society, which they don't call us that anymore. We're like now adherents to their Sixth Declaration, which is kind of their word. and they call us compañeras, but it's just totally different. The more participation and the more inclusive. In fact, their current proposal that they made just a couple weeks ago is that the National Indigenous Congress would no longer be simply indigenous, that other organizations like yours or anybody's could join the National Indigenous Congress. And they are organizing. We belong to a network that supports the Indigenous Government Council, and the members of that council and the National Indigenous Congress have been organizing both with people like us in the United States and also with indigenous communities and nations within the United States. There's a lot of organizing going on.
She didn't ask the question about the trips. If the trips
Can we come back to that for a second just to keep it going?
Yeah.
Evan?
Thank you for your presentation. It's very interesting. I just had a question. You said that one of the values was to, I think it was convince, not repress, or something along those lines. That strikes me as sort of like somewhat problematic because, I mean, in my sort of like understanding, there is sort of like a capitalist bourgeois class. And if you can't really like convince them, and if you don't like repress the bourgeois class, then their interests, they're going to co-opt like whatever institutions you make, however progressive, and sort of like make them serve those interests. So I'm wondering if you could speak to that question.
Well, I'll just clarify what I said,
Okay.
which is convince, not conquer.
Okay.
That's the theory, and it's for internal use. These are principles of how to address each other internally in an organization. And I mean, there are those of us who have been in organizations where there's a lot of manipulation through various forms of like maybe gossip, like organizing behind the scenes. There's different tactics that all of us have seen in organizations to get one's way or sway a vote or something like that. And the purpose of that principle is to convince people that your position is just through explaining it and not using those tactics to impose something. That's what it's about.
Okay, can we?
Let's get as many
Everybody
questions
take
as we
them.
can so that we can get everybody's input and then get a final wrap up or
We're
something
doing
like
that.
that.
Let's have everybody, maximum of 2 minutes, and then final wrap up from the two of you. Is that okay?
Yeah, okay. What I'd like to say is that I know a lot about what's happening in Yemen right now, and it sounds like they set up a government. They have set up, women have to be in each one. They have a presidential council. They have all these things, and they're fighting for their rights. But yet, the U.S. and Saudi Arabia keep on doing all this stuff to them, right? But it sounds to me like you have to have a really strong army, which they have. So they're scaring the hell out of Saudis in the U.S. We don't hear much about it, but they are. They're driving them nuts. That's why the UN says, can't you play fair? Always saying to Yemen, you're not playing fair. You've been hearing that lately? It's insane. Anyway, it sounds like, what I want to know is the military. Is it strong? You know, a lot of people in America, we're all passive, so you just do things peacefully. I'm sorry. You have to fight back. Sometimes you've got to use the military. You guys have one. So how does it work to keep them from destroying that? Maybe they're going to go ahead and let them play for a while, but they're just going to wipe them out if you don't have the military and just keep growing, the way I look at it. So I want to know more about how that's being thought of and how that's being worked on.
Okay, I will keep time on everybody and set it for 2 minutes. And I have 2 points. One is, as I recall, Lenin loved open debate and could be very convincing. And He led a very important revolution. But the other thing I wanted to say is, this is very good. I appreciate this, and I just want to put it together with, a couple of years ago, we had a woman who was an anthropologist, worked with the landless workers movement in Brazil. And the kinds of things they came up with were very interesting in comparison. And also, someone talked about Rojava in Syria, and the kinds of deals they're working with. And it'd be really interesting to have some kind of comparison of how these revolutionary movements, maybe throw in the Bolsheviks too, to talk about this.
Rojava, yeah.
Yes, okay, moving on.
So I was going to ask how large the Zapatista community is today, and also if the Mexican government more or less, other than the flyovers, if they more or less are leaving the communities alone, letting them do their own thing. Do you want to take that, or do you want me to?
Let's move on.
Oh.
And get everybody's comments.
It's Maryland's turn.
Yes.
Oh, thank you. Related to
You're
the
welcome.
military, okay,
Yes.
related to the military, I was going to ask, how do they deal with the paramilitary now? I mean, that's always been a horrible, in fact, I was there when bad stuff was happening. And is the paramilitary still doing all these things?
It's a question about the paramilitary.
Okay, moving on. Back here.
Can either of you recommend something specific that we could read to learn more about the Convince Not Conquer, which I think could be very useful to us during the crisis that we're facing right now among the Solidarity people around Nicaragua?
That's true.
Okay.
Yeah, my question also is about what the threat today, what the threat today is of the paramilitary, based on what they've done in the past. But before I do, also I want to just say that Chiapas is a very beautiful state. Incredible mountains, lakes, rivers, forests, jungle, and it's loaded with resources. And MaryAnn, for almost 20 years, every year took 2 delegations to Chiapas of 9 to 10 people, and took them out to the communities. I was fortunate to be, like you said, on 3 of those trips, and almost every time we arrived at a Zapatista village, the Mayan people just lit up when they saw MaryAnn. Wow. And it was almost like Marcos had arrived, or Che Guevara. One time we were 3 hours late. We were 3 hours late, and all these Mayan women and people were standing around in the dark, and 3 hours late. Nobody was upset. When they saw her again, they just celebrated. So I honor her and her work and your work. And I did have something else to say, but I don't have time.
It's okay. Take time. I'm only going to be half a minute.
Oh, just one last thing.
Okay.
You know, when the Zapatistas rose up, Chase Manhattan Bank was going to finance NAFTA, and they told, was it President Echeverria? What was the president at the time?
Osadillo.
Okay. Anyway, Chase Manhattan Bank said to Osadillo, to Presidente, Chase Manhattan Bank said, we will help, we will finance your development. We will finance all these development of these resources in Chiapas if you get rid of your Zapatista problem. So immediately they said all the military went down to Chiapas.
20 seconds left.
Okay. Went down to Chiapas to wipe them out, and over 100,000 people took to the Mexican Zocala and raised their fists and said, we are all Zapatistas, we are all Marcos, and then because of that response, they withdrew the troops.
Moving on, Norma.
At one point in your presentation, I was thinking about the familial attitudes that people still had. I think capitalism in the United States has been so tremendously successful at separating people from each other, even to the mother-child relation, even to every relationship. And I'm thinking about how we could, at some point in your presentation, emphasize the familial relations that remain as people, because it's only because of friendship that people are going to do revolution, and that's the objective that we have is creating friendship between even us outsiders or us organizers and the people there, but to preserve what's there and then to use that as our organizing principle.
Okay, the gentleman over there. Okay, Raj, and then.
Okay, so my question is that from what you have told us, seems to me we have in Chiapas a kind of a socialism of the community in practice, but then Mexico is a capitalist country, and there's bound to be tension between the two. And how do they manage to keep the capitalism from coming in? What's just by self-organizing, as I've been listening to it, very interesting, and it's been going on for a long time. So what is the relationship between capitalist system and this, what seems to me is indigenous socialism?
Okay, Rich? Okay.
Hey, I passed, I want 5 seconds, simple.
Okay, 5
I'd
seconds.
like, please say a little bit more about the role of the church and how the church, the Catholic Church specifically, or if you want to say something about evangelicals too, the role of religion in that region and how the Zapatistas have worked with them. Maybe there's a lot to say about that. I don't know.
Okay.
That's a whole
topic.
class.
That's it.
Okay, in 10 minutes or less, you can divide it the way you want to, and I'll let you know where it's 12:30.
Do you want me to answer the part about the military, paramilitary? Then it's kind of like the answer is that when the Zapatistas rose up and people saw their army, that they had guns and so forth, there wasn't just 100,000 people in the Zocalo, there were millions. And those millions, and they were all over Mexico, in the Zocalos, in all the big cities and the small cities and wherever. They rose up and told both the Zapatistas and the government to stop it, to stop fighting. And the message to the Zapatistas was, if you stop using your guns, we'll support you. And the message to the government is, if you don't, we're going to stay in the street.
Can you say what Zocalo is again?
Oh, it's a central park.
Okay.
And every city in Mexico has like a town square.
Okay.
Kind of thing. So eventually, it took a year or so, but eventually there was a peace agreement that was signed. It was not completely implemented. The name of the agreement, which you may have heard of, is the San Andres Accords on indigenous rights and culture. It was not fully implemented by the government, and that is why the Zapatistas established the good government juntas and the caracoles, because that was one of the concepts in those agreements. And when the government didn't honor its agreement, the Zapatistas unilaterally implemented it. In terms of military, yes, they have a strong military. What it does is it protects the communities from outside big-time aggression. There are small skirmishes that go on between the communities and the paramilitaries, which are very, very small in number now. Because the government has been unsuccessful in getting people to attack the Zapatistas, because they usually lose. This is over a 25-year period.
Wow.
And what the Zapatistas have done is they've learned how they prioritize negotiation and dialogue as a solution to whatever problems exist.
Oh my
They
God.
still have their guns, they still have their military, they still have all kinds of people trained in security measures, which include martial arts. They do have machetes for farming, and they can use those if they get into a skirmish with somebody down the road. but they have prioritized dialogue and negotiation to the point where they don't need that military that badly anymore. What the military has accomplished is keeping out the drug traffickers. You know, Mexico is like just devastated by organized crime and drug trafficking. I mean, the number of deaths and disappeared is unbelievable. It's very similar to the numbers in Syria. But we keep that quiet in this country because no one wants to deal with it. It's because of our own drug loss that that's happening. If we made drugs like a health issue as opposed to a criminal issue, a lot of that death and destruction in Mexico would go away. But where's the money, honey? Where's the money in that? Well,
Let's try to keep it and listen.
exactly. So the military doesn't quite have the kind of role that you were describing in Yemen because they are not being attacked by another military. What they do is provide security. And because there is a signed truce agreement and a law prohibiting the Mexican army from going there and attacking the communities, and from the Zapatistas doing likewise, because of that law or truce, whatever you want to call it, the military has a very different role. And it's basically to protect the communities from outside influences.
Do you want to ask Arnoldo or somebody to answer
Can
the
we
rest of the
listen to
question?
her rather than ask questions, please?
Have you got the other question?
Yeah, so the issue about values is really important. I think that it's like the convince not defeat value or propose not impose values that guide how they're going to sit down and work together. A value is a relationship. A community is a relationship, right? So whenever we work off, we can't organize, we can't even have a discussion if we don't share even one value together, right? Because we have to have a relationship in order to understand each other. And that's one thing, that's the first thing, one of the first things I think the Zapatistas learned when they were still the EZLN, before they became the EZLN, we know them before, right? That they were internal and debating. I was there for their, when they had their national gathering, right? When they brought everybody together, there was 30,000 people came into the rainforest. I don't like to call it a jungle because language talks a lot about Eurocentrism. I have a mentor here that said it, when black people live on this place of the region here in the Bay Area, they're called swamps. But if white people live on them, they're called wetlands. So the same thing with jungle is like this Eurocentric thing. It's a rainforest, it's a temperate rainforest. The reason I say it right is because there's values involved about how we have to look at each other. So when they have these values, right, I mean, I was saying, when I was there, the debates were fierce. Nobody here in the US, nobody debates like the way the Mexicans or the indigenous people debate. You would probably run away from the debates. You would probably say, what the fuck? You know, it's like, shit, what did I say? Man, because they're in it. They're saying, this is my life, this is our life. Of course I'm going to debate the hell of this because I want this. But that's not what we're talking about, this value about convince. It's like right here, right? About how we convince. Maybe, somebody could come in here and talk about this and convince you that what you're doing is, or defeat you, say, no, you guys, what you're doing, you shouldn't be doing this, you should be doing the Zapatistas. Not even the Zapatistas say that. They've said, we don't want you to be Zapatistas, we want you to be yourselves in your own trenches and your own struggles. The threat of paramilitarization is there, but it kind of goes and it hasn't worked. The last time there was a talk about values, when Marcos changed his name to Galeano, there had been another community was used to attack a Zapatista community, right? And they ended up burning their schools or clinics, stuff like their houses, and they purposely attacked Galeano because they knew he was the important person in the community. And then what did the Zapatistas do, right? Because everybody wanted revenge. I mean, let's go attack them. And then the Zapatistas said, no, man, those are our brothers and sisters. They're confused. They don't know what they're doing. They're confused. if we go attack them, then we open ourselves to more confusion and to be attacked by a larger political military force. So we're here to defend ourselves. We're here to convince them, not defeat them, that this is we're in here together. Because they could have easily gone and you know, because they're an army, they could have easily gone and attacked the community, attacked them and destroyed them, burned them, and so forth. But they said, no, this is what they want us to do, and that's not our decision. They said those brothers and sisters are confused, right? So how do you create freedom? Do you create freedom by blaming each other for the situation, or do we step back and say, how do we get out of this mess? So that's sort of like, I don't think that they would call their way of being socialism, although I think that's a good way as a metaphor for us to understand what they're doing. Because socialism involves other concepts which are problematic. For example, am I a worker or am I a Mexican? Am I a Mexican or am I indigenous? Am I indigenous or am I Purepecha? Or am I mestizo, right? And all those categories have a history, and they all have they all are a chronology of geopolitics. So in every word, every concept has a geopolitical history. So if you call me a mestizo, you're trying to destroy my indigeneity. If you call me a Mexican, you're trying to destroy my Purepecha-ness. If you call me Latino, you're trying to destroy Mexicans. If you call me Hispanic, you're trying to destroy the shit out of everything. Right? So what we call ourselves, so when we're talking about, we're organizing workers, or we're organizing immigrants. Are we going to organize immigrants or organize indigenous people? Are we going to organize indigenous people, or we're organizing Purepechas? For example, the indigenous community here in Mexico has a long history of organizing support for back home. They have mutual aid societies where they raise tons of money here. People send, how many of us are giving 50% of our wages to our community? How many of us are giving 50% of our time when we're free to build our community centers, to upkeep our churches, to upkeep our cultural centers, to help somebody who's in need, right? No, because of capitalism, right? We're automatized, we're monetized. We got to have 2 or 3 jobs to survive, as opposed to have 2 or 3 neighbors to survive, right? So that we have all these revolutionary changes that we need to make. And the Zapatistas are saying, if we can, I always say that if they can do it, we can do it, right? Because you're looking at supposedly the most marginalized communities, the most powerless communities, which are really leading their country. But they've turned the world back upside down, and not in the Hegelian or Marxist sense, but in the anti-Eurocentric, for America to live, Europe must die sense, right? We got a lot of things to talk about, and so it is open that space for us to talk about it.
The church?
The church thing. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Basically, the role of the church was to go in, the Catholic Church was to go into the indigenous communities and teach them catechism. But along with teaching them catechism, this was like the time of liberation theology. And when Bishop Ruiz came to the Diocese of San Cristobal, he was a liberation theologist. He was a Marxist. Yeah. And so they added a few things to the catechism, such as know your rights and what you have rights to do, and that God is on the side of the campesino and stuff like that. And eventually, after the convention that Arnoldo mentioned, which was a huge convention convened by the Diocese of San Cristobal at the request of the Chiapas government and paid for by the Chiapas government, the Bishop Ruiz called all of the catechists and others from the indigenous communities to meet in San Cristobal and have workshops and talk to each other about their problems. And the problems were things like no water, no jobs, no housing, no health care, no education, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They had nothing. And I mean, because they were brand new communities in many cases for people who had just been kicked off the fincas or plantations. And so what Bishop Ruiz did, Arnoldo mentioned this, is he brought in a bunch of organizers from the north. They were Marxist organizers of different kinds, and they came in and worked with both the bishop and the communities on preparing for this big convention, which I think was in 1973 or 4, I can't remember.
74.
4. And the upshot of that was that they helped form a large and extremely important campesino organization that would, and taught them how to advocate to the local government for what they needed.